Welcome to Chatham House. Welcome to our roundtable today on the first 100 days of the Biden administration. It's wonderful to see so many people engaged. I know because I've looked at your names, I know who's on the list, and I feel like we've developed quite a community over the course of the 2020 elections and through these now nearly, not quite, but nearly 100 days. And it's really good to be able to take stock. It's an extraordinary time to take stock, not least because last week in many ways was a very interesting week for President Biden and his foreign policy with the announcement with respect to US troops in Afghanistan. I'm Leslie Vinjamori. I think I know all of you. I'm director of the US and the Americas program, and here we have a tremendous panel today. They're really very well known to you. I'm sort of giddy with excitement because I'm so just delighted to have these three speakers here. I should say we are on the record. I'm going to say a very brief introduction, a few remarks, and turn it right over to them. If you lose me for reasons of internet, carry on and I'll be right back. I'm in New York City and I'm on a slightly uncertain internet connection. The first 100 days, I think it was FDR that talked about 100 days. He didn't actually talk about the first 100 days as I understand it, but it was the beginning of us thinking that the first 100 days were some kind of honeymoon period in which the president could accomplish many things that perhaps would become more tricky after those 100 days. It's difficult, I think, to think about Joe Biden as having entered the White House in a honeymoon phase, given the hundreds of thousands of Americans who had died from the pandemic. I think there were over 3,000 Americans dying each day when he entered the White House. He entered about a week after President Trump had been impeached and 2.5 weeks before a Senate trial to convict the president took place. Of course, President Trump was acquitted. He inherited a very divided and partisan America with barely a majority in the Senate, a slimmer majority in the House, and just a very, very divided and divisive America. So difficult perhaps to talk about a honeymoon period. Nonetheless, the idea that America is back certainly rings true for many Europeans on certain dimensions, but perhaps not the same America or the same style of engagement or the same future that we might have expected had there been a different result in the 2016 election. So to engage in this, to share their views, you will have read their work, but let me just very briefly introduce them. Stephen Wertheim is director of the Grand Strategy Program at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, definitely an institute that we're all very interested in watching, a really fascinating mission. Stephen is author of the book, most recently, Tomorrow the World, The Birth of US Global Supremacy. And I think it's safe to say, Stephen, that you are widely regarded as being a very important voice in those advocating for restraint in America's global engagements. Correct me, I'm sure you will, if I'm wrong. Stephen is going to be followed by Susan Glasser, who I'm personally thrilled and delighted has agreed to join this panel. Susan, you have taken us through many things, not least the Trump years in your writings. You're a staff writer for The New Yorker, and your column, the letters from Trump's Washington Now, Life in Washington. You are CNN global commentator. And of course, together with Peter Baker, you are the author of a couple of books, most recently, The Man Who Ran Washington, Life and Times of James Baker. And I can see that Sir David Manning is on the call and many people who will have known and worked with James Baker. So it is really, really great of you to do this. We know how busy you are. Thank you for doing this. Gideon Rockman, you are a friend of Chatham House. I think it's very safe to say, a regular, and we deeply appreciate always the fact that you take the time to do this. Everybody reads your work here in the UK. You are chief foreign affairs commentator. Your most recent book, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, is Easternization, War and Peace in the Asian Century. So three tremendous people to talk to us about their, I think and hope, very different perspectives on Joe Biden's first 100 days and where we're going. So let me turn it over to you, Stephen Wertheim, first. Is this the America that is Joe Biden taking America into the places, and more importantly, perhaps from your point of view, not taking America into the sort of engagements that you think he should or could? What is your reaction to the Afghanistan decision? But more generally, your take on the first 100 days, almost 100 days. I think we hit that mark in another week or so.
Well, thank you very much indeed. It's my pleasure to be with you for this discussion and to be in conversation with three people whose work I very much admire. America is back is the story that the president has wanted to tell. It's a line he used even before entering the White House. And what it seems to mean is that the administration is trying to restore the basic patterns of U.S. foreign policy prior to Donald Trump. So that means re-engagement with diplomacy and international institutions. It means renewed efforts on global challenges, especially climate change, which the administration has emphasized in domestic and foreign policy and within the government bureaucracy. And it means more rhetorical emphasis on democracy and human rights, at least relative to Trump. In other words, it's a return to the liberal part of America's pursuit of liberal hegemony across the globe. So what it also means is a return to armed hegemony, in which the United States divides the world into subordinate allies and actual or potential adversaries, and attempts to shoulder the military burdens toward both. Now, it's worth noting the Trump administration didn't actually depart from this pattern. In fact, it extended U.S. alliance commitments and failed to end any wars. But Trump himself didn't seem wedded to this approach either, whereas Biden appears to be. And so amidst the pandemic and domestic turmoil, the administration has requested a Pentagon budget of $715 billion for the next year. So there's a lot of evidence to support the story of restoration that Biden himself has told. But on two outstanding issues so far, I think Biden has signaled meaningful breaks with a trajectory that U.S. foreign policy was following when he was vice president. And these are breaks that recognize that the United States is now no longer operating in the unipolar moment of the late 1990s and must adjust. And the first outstanding issue is China. The administration, it seemed just about possible coming into the administration that it might enter signaling a deflation of tension with China and rejecting the truculence of the Trump years. The administration has done no such thing. In fact, Secretary of State Blinken said that Trump was right to get tough with China and disagreed with the tactics. So now presidents from both political parties have gotten behind what Biden has termed extreme competition with China, something that, to my mind, looks rather like a Cold War between the world's number one and number two powers. Perhaps the military competition could be tempered by Biden's desire to work with China on common challenges like climate change. Or you might say it's all the more remarkable that the administration has so far seemed willing to ratify and solidify a confrontational approach toward China, given its own desire to combat climate change, which is an effort that surely would benefit from a greater cooperation on a number of fronts with China. So if this trend continues, the United States may reinvigorate its approach of liberal hegemony, but only by confining it to the non-Chinese world for the foreseeable future. And just last week, as you mentioned, Leslie, Biden made a second shift from pre-Trump patterns. He decided to fully withdraw U.S. ground troops from Afghanistan. And he argued, not merely that the United States had bigger priorities, he also made a sweeping rejection of what he called forever war, of military operations that cannot be ended because their objectives are ill-defined or impossible to verifiably fulfill. Biden implied that endless war was unacceptable to him in principle. So although he confined himself to Afghanistan and to the use of ground troops there, meaning that the US war in Afghanistan may not in fact be over, he has established standards to apply himself and for others to apply to him. Why do US ground troops remain in Iraq and Syria, for example? How can their mission of preventing a hypothetical future resurgence of the Islamic State ever be decisively achieved? How will the administration now review the larger war on terror, which has expanded into a great portion of Africa? Why try to sanction North Korea into submission forever or until it relinquishes its one guarantee of security, nuclear weapons? And if the administration succeeds in its efforts to restore the Iran nuclear agreement, will it go farther to move toward normalizing diplomatic relations with Iran so the countries are not always on the brink of war or fighting proxy wars as in Yemen? Suddenly, by Biden's own logic, in other words, the United States has an array of endless wars it might end and new ones it might prevent. So it may be that Biden intends only to make a US global leadership or hegemony more sustainable, both across the world and in the greater Middle East. But intriguingly, he has been responsive to public demands to end America's longest forever war in Afghanistan. And he himself declared that diplomacy does not require US service members to be in harm's way. In fact, a US military presence, he concluded, was entangling American diplomacy in local conflicts. That insight also punctures at least the ideology, the self-presentation of liberal hegemony, with its assumption that the United States must be militarily dominant in order for other good forms of engagement to take place. So I am rather interested now to see what the next 100 days will bring, and I'll just hope to have provoked you suitably, and we'll leave it there for now.
Thank you, Stephen. I have no doubt that our audience and perhaps our panel will come back to the question of Afghanistan, clearly something that has divided the transatlantic community as well as many others, not least for the decision, but also for the way the decision is being taken, not a conditions-based decision, but a timeline. But I want to turn to Susan to get her view, not on Afghanistan or your comments necessarily, but Susan, your own take on the first 100 days. I follow you on Twitter. I said when I wrote to you that I really liked your tweet when you said I believe you didn't expect to be talking about how different President Biden was from President Obama. You obviously anticipated, I imagine, something different from President Trump, but over to you, and we really look forward to your remarks.
Well, Leslie, first of all, thank you for that incredibly nice introduction and for the opportunity to talk with everyone today. Gideon and Stephen are two such insightful commentators and people who understand kind of that interplay of American foreign policy and, sort of the political moment writ large. And I think that's the thing that I would start with in trying to understand and evaluate, sort of Biden and his foreign policy. You can't really look at that in a vacuum. And the key thing, especially for a Chatham House audience in the UK or elsewhere.
We'll give Susan just one moment to quieten the
Sorry, Ellie, our co-author, and she has strong views. Generally speaking, she has been a pro-Biden type dog, but when someone comes to the door, basically she's against them, whether they're whatever their party. So the thing that I want to start with, though, is about actually domestic politics, because that really is the key to understanding the Biden presidency. It is his priority. And in some respects, the sort of rapidly proliferating menu of international crises and problems and decisions that he has represent to a certain extent a distraction for what has overall been an extremely disciplined Biden team so far, right? This is a White House that believes that they were elected to office at a time of massive national crisis, really. They have seen that was a way that they won the election in their view because of a pretty disciplined and tight focus on addressing the COVID pandemic and the attendant sort of economic catastrophe, and then add into that our internal sort of racism reckoning and just a sense of the moment as being very much about how do we overcome the threats to American democracy from the inside. And so it's funny because it's the kind of thing that often is talked about in a foreign policy sense in a way that's pretty cliched, and I don't think was the right frame to look at many previous presidents. But I just don't think you can understand where the Biden team is coming from except to recognize that that is not only the priority of the White House, but also that in some ways his foreign policy team is very much on board with that. And Jake Sullivan, who is the national security advisor and I think a key shaper of the kind of strategic focus of it, he was Hillary Clinton's chief policy advisor, both domestic and foreign policy in the 2016 campaign. That was a searing experience. And I think he is the reason why you hear not only Jake himself, but also the president now speaking almost at every turn about the connection between America's internal weaknesses and the need for sort of restoration and reinvigoration on the home front, and how that connects with what they portray as a widening set of confrontations with a sort of resurgent authoritarian powers around the world. That's a different frame maybe than the one that Stephen has offered. And I do think the other thing to think of is I understand where he's coming from, but I think just in terms of trying to understand where Biden and his team are at, they don't see this as American hegemony. They do not think that leadership and hegemony are synonyms. And from their perspective, I think they would say it's not just a restorationist project of, a sort of return to the status quo ante or to the liberal international order, but the reason that there's some continuity perhaps, and even in a surprising way between the Trump foreign policy and the Biden foreign policy is because it was fundamentally an American, recognition that it's facing challenges from the likes of Russia and particularly China that have become more sharp-edged, more manifest, and are in the context of more than a dozen years of global decline in democracy that includes the United States. So that's the big picture framing, which I think is extremely important to understand if you're trying to, even interpret or to, guess where they're at, right? I do think that framing is crucial. Last fall, trying to think about what a President Biden would do in terms of America and the world, as opposed to some of these domestic challenges. Bill Burns, who was the head of Carnegie, but now has become the kind of surprise choice for the director of the CIA in the new Biden administration. He wrote a piece in which he suggested that there were essentially three possibilities for the Biden foreign policy, which he defined as retrenchment, restoration, and reinvention. And arguably, indeed, certainly 100 days is not long enough to judge that. My own view is that I agree very much with Stephen here that Joe Biden's personal instinct and sort of the kind of branding that they rolled out for their foreign policy is restorationist, is basically America is back. Hey, we're really sorry about the last few years. That was kind of embarrassing. We appreciate you sticking with us. No more crazy tweets. A return to quote unquote regular order is what we're offering. And I remember very vividly seeing Joe Biden at the Munich Security Conference right before he announced his presidential campaign, in which he literally, that was the frame of his speech, which was, hey guys, stick with us, we'll be back. And thanks for keeping our place warm at the head of the table. I think that's the surround sound though. So it also does reflect to a certain extent Biden's personal views. He's not going to be rejecting ever in his public commentary, or I believe even in private, the notion of American leadership or the need for continuity in what he and others in the sort of Washington blob, would define as the sort of liberal international order. So, that's going to be a continuity for him. And actually, interestingly enough, I would argue, you mentioned, Leslie, my tweet about Obama and Biden, and how there's been lots of talk in Washington, like, oh, well, is, this a break with the Obama foreign policy, whether it's on, not rejoining the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or doing, sort of standing up to the generals on Afghanistan in a way that didn't happen in the Obama years. And actually, it's been a lot on the domestic front as well that I was referencing. So you see Biden, kind of going big and saying, forget, I'm just not going to sit around and be held hostage by Republicans when it comes to a big infrastructure spending program. I'm going to proceed and hope to bring along at least Republican voters, if not Republican members of Congress. So that's been a lot of the chatter. However, listening to Stephen, the final point I would make before we get to Gideon is, oddly enough, I guess I find myself thinking, though, that there's more continuity than people might realize with the Obama administration. First of all, I think if you're trying to read the tea leaves, it's very important to understand who is making foreign policy and national security decisions in the Biden era. And the answer is the Obama era is making these decisions. It represents certainly a step up in terms of titles and responsibilities for people like Tony Blinken or Jake Sullivan, but they were presences throughout the entire 2 terms of the Obama administration. They learned its successes, they learned its failures. On the question of China, which remains and has been portrayed as the biggest strategic challenge by the Biden folks, I think it's enormously important that Kurt Campbell, who was running Asia policy at the State Department during Hillary Clinton's tenure in the Obama years, is now been brought in to the National Security Council, not just as senior director, but really at a more senior level, I think, and to oversee that. There was and has been an ongoing internal debate among Democrats about the best approach to China. That's not over by any means, but Kurt Campbell has been trying to get America to pivot to Asia, but also to take, I think, much more sanguine and jaundiced view of the nature of the threat posed by China than had been the case. He is not just coming to this now because Donald Trump said some mean words about the Chinese. And so that, I think, is really important to understand, that certainly they're going to make some decisions that are different, like in the Afghanistan decision, but that also reflects the changed reality. The last American military casualty in Afghanistan was 14 months ago. The state of the war there and the US president are just so dramatically different than what it was in 2009 when the brand new Obama administration was making a decision about American troop presence there. And so, the reality is different. And so 8 years have passed. And then a final quick thought, what do we even mean? And I would challenge everybody on this. What do we even mean when we say about the Trump administration foreign policy? And I think that's actually quite a big challenge for us all in understanding what Biden is and is not doing. Because the important thing to understand, despite the sort of endless circular spin, is that there was a Trump administration foreign policy, and then there was a Trump foreign policy. And on key issues, they did not overlap. And so what are we talking about if we say that there's continuity with China or Russia? We heard, I heard just again the other day from President Trump how, he was the toughest on Russia that there ever was. And obviously that's neither an accurate nor a credible statement. But Joe Biden came to office. He doesn't want to talk about Russia anymore. But with 100,000 troops on the border with Ukraine, Putin determined, if nothing else, to test Biden, as well as facing an extremely complicated domestic political concerns. I mean, this is now entering the stage of full-blown crisis. And what's interesting to me is that I think I have a sense of where Biden's instincts are at this point, but I really would caution people against drawing sweeping conclusions about his foreign policy at a moment when, look, the last year has challenged all of us. In a time when almost 600,000 Americans have died in the pandemic, at a time when our own people sacked the US Capitol for the first time since 1814, what does national security even mean anymore? And so I'll just leave it at that.
Thank you. And I thank you also for right back at the end, taking us back to that moment. We all know that we're now expecting the decision on the Derek Chauvin trial, which might take America into a very different conversation very rapidly, or intensify an acceleration and ongoing conversation that could bring the president's attention right back home. One reaction I have to your comment is, of course, if there is continuity, both of the people and of the foreign policy on a number of dimensions from Obama to Biden, it does raise a question about what exactly domestic foreign policy for the middle class means, and whether maybe Obama actually was doing foreign policy for the middle class through the Affordable Care Act and any other number of policies, although clearly not all. But we'll come back to that, and I really appreciate your interventions. Thank you, Susan. Gideon, over to you.
Thank you, Leslie, and thank you very much to everyone. It's great to be able to hear some views from across the Atlantic, because it's so difficult to travel now. So I'd like to pick up really where Susan and Stephen left off, and at the risk of being kind of gratuitously provocative, say I think there is continuity with Obama, but I think there's also continuity with Trump. I think there's underlying continuity. Obviously there are some big breaks. The biggest is in terms of style, and that's hugely important. We no longer feel that there's a crazy man in the White House, and that matters a lot. Everyone's feels more relaxed. But if you look at the actual substance of what these three successive presidents were doing, I think you can say that in different ways they've all been coming to terms with the end of the unipolar moment. They've all been trying to refocus the United States on domestic problems, put domestic problems first. And they've all been gradually, despite, I think, Stephen's, justified talk of America still remaining, wanting to be the liberal hegemon, but simultaneously, while talking about that, they've all been pulling back a bit, or at least trying to reduce commitments overseas. So to start with Afghanistan, yes, it's a dramatic moment, but it's also a moment that we've seen coming for a long time. I mean, there was that overquoted Taliban thing about, you have watchers, but we have time. Everybody knew at some point America would pull out. Trump had said they were going to pull out. Obama was clearly reluctant about the surge, even if he went along with it. And I think that fits into a more general pullback from, the greater Middle East, if one can use that term. Obviously, Obama was reluctant. He didn't get involved in Syria, famously, despite enormous pressure in 2013. He talked about leading from behind on Libya. Then Trump, in a way that actually kind of replays some of the shock about what's happening with Afghanistan, betraying people who'd worked with you. There was the pullout from Syria, where he suddenly said, you know what, we're out of here. Now, he did it in a very different, more brutal way than Biden, but this underlying instinct, similar, I think. And then again, when they talked about foreign policy, and all three, I think, have been attempting in different ways to refocus on great power competition, particularly with China. As Susan said, it was Kurt Campbell who designed the pivot. He's back now. But even under Obama, although they found it very difficult to get out of the Middle East, that was the idea. They kept being dragged back in by conflicts, but the underlying philosophy was we've got to focus on China. Then similarly with Trump, I mean, of course, he had his own personal idiosyncrasies, the obsession with having a great relationship with Xi Jinping, not being that interested in human rights and all that. But underlying, he notches up, again, the confrontation with China, which had begun under Obama. I mean, just to pivot back a little bit, I remember talking to one of the Obama people, and he said, our policy with China is now 80% confrontation, only 20% cooperation. That was under Obama. Then with Trump, you get the addition of the trade war, which, as Susan pointed out, Biden doesn't really seem to be pulling back from. This idea that it's no longer, globalized. The idea that win-win cooperation, as the Chinese like to call it, is no longer kind of assumed or taken for granted in the United States. I think that's kind of happened. So it's true that Biden has added an extra emphasis on human rights and Xinjiang. But again, as Susan was saying, while Trump himself didn't care about that, the Trump administration was the first to label Xinjiang a genocide. And, it was simply confirmation by Blinken that they were not going to stop calling it that. That had already happened. Okay, Russia, we can say, yes, big change there, in the sense that Trump had this bizarre relationship with Putin, still slightly unexplained unwillingness to criticize him. But again, there were some underlying continuities, because in some ways, the Trump administration toughened policy on Ukraine. Famously, Obama was very reluctant to supply the Ukrainians with weapons. The Trump administration actually did. And you still have this slightly ambiguous thing that America says it will respond, does respond with sanctions. The toughening up of sanctions on Russia under Putin continues. And then the domestic focus, again, started under Obama. What was, nation building at home? That was his big slogan. And it wasn't that different to me from America First. It was a prettier way of saying America First. And now we have a foreign policy for the middle class. And as a German diplomat was saying on a call I was on just last week, she said, I'm not totally sure what's the difference between America First and Americans First. Is it really that different? It may be in some of the details, but the underlying thinking that, we've got plenty of troubles at home, we've got to fix those first, is across all three. Yes, there are big differences. There's dropping the Trumpian, the big differences in some respects. The Trumpian confrontation with allies, clearly Biden's going to try to not be so confrontational with the European allies. The readoption of moralistic language, which Trump almost sort of prided himself in not using, and the re-engagement on climate change, which is clearly important and is a real difference. But I think if viewed from Moscow and Beijing, and then maybe even London and Brussels, the underlying picture is an America that's being much more equivocal about being the world's policeman, and that's been going on since 2008, and is, in different ways, it's expressed by very different politicians. But the fact that such different politicians come to sort of similar endpoints tells you something. And finally, I think that all of this means that they're responding in similar ways to similar domestic and international background. And the international background is that, you just look at the economics, American unipolarity is over. I mean, it may be by some measures still the world's largest economy, but, the rise of China continues unabated. It's the world's largest manufacturer, trader, etc. So there's an increasing realization that the United States cannot bear any burden and hasn't been able to for some time. And I think that also the US understands and the world understands that there has been a big change in the Trump years, but not so much in policy, but in our understanding of the depths of America's domestic crisis. So you said it was appropriate to end with January the 6th, and I think it was, because nobody can really unsee that. It is enormously reassuring to have Biden in. It was enormously reassuring, frankly, to see him inaugurated on the 20th. We did slightly wonder. And so there's the immediate crisis is past, but the world and America can't unsee what happened. And they can't fail to notice the opinion polls that show so much of the Republican Party believing that the election was fraudulent, continuing to back Trump. So there is a question mark in everybody's mind about, there's a kind of return to normalcy, at least in the way an American president conducts himself, but a fear of a sort of deep underlying instability. And frankly, I don't think anybody out in the outside world really knows how to factor that in, because it's just so, to use a sort of unpolicy word, so weird. It's so difficult to think your way through it. And so just to finish thinking, I was talking to a friend who was on the British Foreign Policy Review. And he said at a certain point, he had said, look, in our thinking, should we factor in the idea that America might actually stop being a democracy? This was when they were writing during the Trump years. And everyone was kind of silence in the room. And he said, everyone just said, we can't get our heads around that. We just have to assume American stability. But actually, if you look at the United States. I sorely hope that it'll come back and that Biden has saved the day, but I don't think you can assume it.
Thank you, Gideon. My energy level has just come down. I've become more concerned, but I think much of what you say resonates. I guess I want to come back to Susan and to Stephen on one question stemming from your remarks before we come out to the audience. I mean, on the one hand, you say, America's been kind of equivocal about its role in the world, and that's not new, and there's a continuity. On the other hand, there's a sense of impending crisis and that getting deeper and darker. And of course, Joe Biden, as Susan so eloquently has reminded us, has taken on domestic division and inequality and anti-racism and all of these critically important things very much as key to his agenda. And so I guess my question for Susan, especially looking at the first 100 days and looking forward, is A, can he do it? And which part is he where is he gonna hit, or where is he gonna succeed, and what can we expect? And B, is it gonna have any impact on foreign policy, right? Because if you listen to what Gideon said, it's sort of at some level irrelevant. America's on a singular trajectory in terms of being equivocal about its engagements, dialing them down. And perhaps the only thing the domestic side tells us is that people are going to be even more concerned. People outside of America's borders are going to be even more concerned about that equivocation because it looks like it's grounded in something deep and dark and divided within the United States. But where is Biden going, and where is America going on the domestic front? And how much does he have the ability to move the needle on all of that?
So I think that's actually where the stories diverge, perhaps, even too much. You've hit right on, Leslie, I believe, what is the inherent contradiction of Biden foreign policy, right? If the contradiction of Trump foreign policy was that his administration thought one thing and he thought something different, and that was really an irreconcilable set of differences often on many issues. I think for Biden, the challenge is that there is almost the tension here is between wanting to project the idea that normalcy has returned, that we are restoring regular order, and the need, both politically in particular, to be real enough to understand that the crisis is not over, and that we're in the middle of the crisis, and that the things that are required to be done as a result of being in the middle of the crisis for our democracy, in terms of a two-party system that's broken, one of the two parties embracing even radical anti-democratic methods, the inability for Congress to function in the way that it was intended, the hyper politicization and polarization around issues that on which there used to be a form of national consensus. All of these things meditate towards pulling the Biden people towards admitting and actually using the fact that this crisis is occurring still, and yet in both right and left right now in Washington, for reasons that will be familiar to everyone on this call, there is also just that human nature and the pressure to pretend that we've moved on, or the left wants to have its own arguments with each other. That's always where the energy is in the Democratic Party, and vice versa, with the right. And so those things are at odds with each other. How do they affect foreign policy, and can Biden do it? First of all, there is a very short window. I do think that is really the case. The betting, and that's driving a lot of what you're seeing right now in Washington, is an overwhelming sense, even by Democrats, that odds suggest they're going to lose the House of Representatives in the next midterm elections in 2022. And therefore, that is part of why you're seeing a more maximalist strategy from Biden and his team when it comes to Capitol Hill. That may not be the case, but they're almost seeing the sort of go big strategy as a kind of long ball, sort of effort to create a different political reality. In terms of the foreign policy aspects of all this, focus on America's domestic renewal, on its domestic politics, on its domestic problems. One thing I would say that I learned a little bit the hard way in the last 4 years of Trump was I started out maybe making that assumption that Gideon offered, the idea that there was totally different surround sound, but that there was a form of continuity between Obama and Trump in the sense that they both saw that, pulling back from the world, or at least from, parts of the Middle East was just where the politics were at, as well as where, sort of the economics were at. But I think what I came to realize as the 4 years went on is because the prescriptions for dealing with that are so radically different, I don't take that for granted. I no longer am as willing to make that broad brush comparison anymore. And I understand that in many European capitals today, there's a absolutely looking at some of the continuity or the commonality of an America that finds it distasteful increasingly to, bear the military burdens, at least, of the rest of the world, that you could see that as consistent. What I would say is that I've come to understand and appreciate more that when the prescriptions are so different, I think the Biden people, to a certain extent, are going to be not only just rhetorically, but actually far more willing. They're not just rejoining multilateral institutions. They're looking for ways to engage in creative multilateral diplomacy. They're going to be looking for ways in which they can share the burden. And that puts more onus on the Europeans than simply saying, well, America is no longer trustworthy. And so, that actually might make it harder, more complicated. In some ways, opposing Donald Trump is an easy thing to do. I think what the Biden people are suggesting is something that is more complicated. And then the final point I just wanted to make is that I get it about, this isn't an inward-looking America, and what really is the difference between America first and, nation building at home. All I would say is, folks, there's a big difference between America first and nation building at home. And, America First is a program of both domestic and international nationalism, nativism, and sort of denialism in a way that is fundamentally at odds and incompatible with international law and order, and it's fundamentally different. So it's a minor point, but I feel that it's actually a really kind of important one.
It is an important point, and I think it's one that Europeans actually do take seriously, because certainly I hear many Europeans very nervous that the America First agenda might return after the next presidential election. So I think regardless of this awareness that Gideon has really illuminated for us of America's changing role, and perhaps in a single direction, there is a deep awareness and concern, and I thank you for that. Final quick question to you, Stephen, before I come to Alana McLaren and then Sir Peter Westmacott and then Hans. Stephen, what should we be looking for next? What's the next big decision on the radar screen on foreign policy concretely? And do you really think that the September 11th deadline is is the US gonna be able to hold to that? Do you anticipate that being delivered?
Well, I'm not quite sure what the next big decision point will be. It may well relate to Ukraine and Russia, as Susan has suggested, so it may not be one the administration sets for itself. I think with respect to the September 11th deadline, there's no question that there are people who are very invested in continuing the fight in Afghanistan and who clearly see gains for the Taliban as a defeat for the United States. Now, Biden made pretty clear, and I think one of the reasons why I do think that he intends to effectuate a full withdrawal of US ground troops, he made pretty clear that he does not consider the United States to be responsible for the political fate of Afghanistan. That the only reason why he sees the use of force as being justified there at this point is to go after terrorists who might be plotting attacks on the US homeland. But there's no question that the domestic politics are very difficult. And I think, to respond to what Gideon said a little bit, I fully agree, I think, with the depiction of continuity that he gave. But I think what we are seeing is over time, even the same people who were in the Obama administration have come to different policy conclusions because the United States is so entangled internationally and faces such difficult domestic pressures, it turns out that to really reduce the US commitment in the Middle East now appears to require pulling out of Afghanistan in the minds of many of the same people who effectuated a surge of US forces in Afghanistan in the first term of the Obama administration, and then decided to leave that war continuing for the United States by the end of the Obama administration. So I think the options under the surface of continuity, more than a surface, an iceberg of continuity, at least at the bottom of it, I'm mixing up the iceberg metaphor. You get the point. There is something happening where there's, on the one hand, coherent pressure directing the United States toward great power competition, and particularly with China, and that's happening across Democrats and Republicans. But on the other, there's also cross pressure moving the United States toward restraint, because it turns out it's very hard to actually limit America's military role in the world and focus on domestic needs when the United States has made all the commitments that it's made abroad. And so I think Biden is entering into this larger picture. And so far, he's given a bit to the great power competition option, and he's given a bit toward the restraint option, much as Donald Trump did as well.
Thank you. I'm going to take these three questions, Alana, Sir Peter, and then Hans and Gideon. I'm going to come to you first, regardless of what they ask. I'm going to come to you first because you didn't get to come back on this. So Alana, if you ask your question.
Hi, thank you very much for offering your perspectives. I just wanted to ask you what your views on the recent sanctions against Russia are and how you see the situation evolving, given Putin's increasing intransigence both domestically and internationally.
Thank you, Alana. Peter.
Thanks, Leslie, and thank you all. Wonderful discussion. Two halves to my question, if you will indulge me. One is about how the Biden team are working, and the other is a country-specific question. On the first, I wonder whether people can tell us what about the policy-making process? Back in the Obama time, even though there was a pretty close identity of views and values and a lot of foreign policy, on the whole, what tended to happen was that the NSC went around in a number of circles, lots of different meetings, principals, deputies, and whatever, and eventually the president took a decision, and then allies were told and invited to kind of fall into line, if I can put it like that. And when it comes now to some of the policy decisions that the new team have taken, although everybody's delighted to have a multilateralist, consensual, allied-focused president in Joe Biden, if you look at Yemen, you look at Afghanistan, you look at even aspects of Iran policy, I'm not sure that it looks like there is a real process of the consultation with close allies that we might have expected. And I wondered whether people had a sense of the direction of travel on that. And then the other half of my question is the one president who I think I'm right in saying Joe Biden hasn't yet phoned is Recep Tayyip Erdogan of Turkey. And bearing in mind what people were saying about the link between domestic policy and American values and democracy and rule of law and freedom and all that kind of stuff, I wondered whether people had a sense of where was he going to go with Turkey? Because at the moment, it seems to me in the kind of in tray with a too difficult post-it on it. He's decided what to do about Saudi Arabia. He's moving in a certain direction on Iran. But what about Turkey, where there's a whole series of grievances on both sides, some of which are going to blow up, whether it's the Armenian genocide resolution or whether it's going to be the indictment of Halkbank or other stuff going on between Turkey and Vladimir Putin. And I wondered if anyone had a sense of that. Thanks.
And Hans, if you could introduce yourself, Hans.
Hi, yeah, thanks, Leslie. Hans Kundinani from the Europe program, Chatham House. Really interesting discussion, especially this kind of complex mixture of sort of continuity and change and this idea of restoration. I guess this is a question mainly for Stephen. I was really struck, Stephen, by what you said about a sort of return to liberal hegemony, but with an emphasis on the liberal part. And I sort of wanted to take that a little bit of a step further, because it strikes me that, I mean, what I'm very struck by in the Biden administration is its sort of ideological component, right? Particularly this focus on democracy, in contrast to Obama, who had this realist kind of streak that, he talked about Reinhold Niebuhr and so And again, obviously this comes out of the sort of Trump moment, this kind of renewed focus on democracy, but in foreign policy terms, what it reminds me of more than any of the previous presidents that we mentioned is actually the Bush administration. There's almost a kind of a neocon kind of element to it, even though it's about democracy defense rather than democracy promotion. And this comes out in the approach to China as well, right? Although, as has been said, there's a certain amount of continuity on China policy. It seems to me that the difference is that whereas the Trump administration framed it in terms of great power competition, the Biden administration has reframed it as an ideological struggle between democracies and authoritarian states. And so I guess my question is what the sort of implications of that are, if that's correct, and in particular for sort of allies, because we constantly say, and Biden says, is recommitting to allies. In that sense, it's a sort of a restoration. But is there not also a kind of a recalibration of relationships with allies in this kind of ideological way? And that has implications on the one hand for authoritarian allies like Saudi Arabia, and then interesting what Peter was just saying about Turkey, a similar kind of situation. But conversely, also looking at this from a European perspective, I'm very struck by how, because the Biden administration has emphasized so much that it wants to recommit to those alliances with Europeans, that actually the Biden administration has no leverage over, the EU and Germany, even when they're pursuing interests which are opposed to American interests. I'm thinking of Nord Stream 2 in the German case, the China investment agreement in the EU case. But because Biden has telegraphed that he wants to have a very close relationship with these democratic allies, he has almost no leverage, and so the EU and the Germans are just doing what they want to do.
Great question, as always. Of course, Pompeo was fairly ideological, but without the commitment, perhaps, to allies. Let me come to Gideon first. I don't know if you want to take the Russia sanctions, Hans.
Yeah, I'll answer them all, but briefly, because I think the people in Washington probably are closer to it than me. So just, as I say, briefly, on the Russia sanctions thing, we've seen a gradual ratcheting up. The Russians do seem genuinely alarmed by the threat of a ban on the purchase of Russian debt, which is a new form of financial sanction, which clearly is the biggest single lever America has. And the Russians and the Chinese now openly say we've got to find a way around this dollar hegemony thing. And the Americans have a tactical question. It's their strongest weapon. Do they keep using it? Or if they overuse it, do they sort of accelerate us going to some crypto world? I don't know, but it's a very interesting moment. On consultation with allies, yeah, I mean, I think that you're right. As far as we can tell, there wasn't much consultation over Afghanistan. And my impression has always been that it's so hard to form consensus within Washington that the idea of bringing in even more actors who are allowed to have an opinion is just too much. So the allies tend to be just told what's happening. And, once America's pulling out of Afghanistan, they're going to have to pull out because they can't hang on them themselves. Although I do think that there is relief in Europe that at least there may not be consultation, but also there isn't, as Hans was saying, as much coercion, the actual waving of the big stick. And I think that they're, slightly contradicting myself, having made this case of continuity, there was a concern in Europe that Trump's second term might have really given full rein to his instincts, even pulled America out of NATO, become much more coercive to allies such as the UK and Germany, deployed sanctions against them as well. And that at least is off the table. I think, I'll let somebody else deal with Hans's question. I think the Erdogan thing is incredibly interesting, though, because I think in different ways, both Trump and Obama made a big play for Erdogan. I think in somebody's book, they claimed that that Obama initially spoke to Erdogan more than any other foreign leader because he was meant to be the model of a Muslim Democrat, and that's clearly all gone by the by. Trump liked him for other reasons. I think he said to Bob Woodward, he liked him because he was so tough and mean and horrible, and that spoke to something inside Trump. I mean, my sense, to make the continuity argument is that although you're right, the fact he hasn't spoken to Erdogan suggests he's thinking about it, is that in the end, America will have to come back to this uneasy relationship they've had with him, because you can't have an antagonistic relationship completely antagonistic relationship with Turkey, which is an important NATO ally, which you don't want to force into the arms of Russia, and which you'll have to talk about a whole range of issues, because Erdogan's actually been quite successful in expanding Turkey's regional footprint. They matter in the Caucasus, in Libya, in the Mediterranean. So a bit as with MBS, you can sort of posture and say, we're going to have to really change the thing. But in the end, it comes back to these are important countries that you need a relationship with. And the last thing on China, you're right, that the framing of the confrontation is different, ideological as opposed to great power. But I wonder whether, to some extent, that's to do with the way that American policymakers talk to themselves. Trump was a uber realist, not interested in morality, just said I want the best deal possible for Americans. So that's the way he spoke about great power confrontation with China. The Democrats do believe in America's moral role, so they will cast it in that way. The rest of the world may think, well, this is just America trying to defend its share, and doing it by using this moral language. And some of us respond to it. I do a bit, but that the underlying reality is of America that's confronting a rise in China, and perhaps using slightly different language depending on who's in power.
Susan?
Thank you so much. There's so much to unpack there. Let me just quickly weigh in on a couple of these excellent questions. First of all, on Russia, I think that there is a sense, and I spent some time, trying to understand where they're coming from on Russia, since it isn't something that Biden spoke a lot about in the campaign, aside from making it very clear he was going to not be personally sucking up to Vladimir Putin in the same way. And I think I wouldn't overestimate the simple fact that they just don't want to be bogged down. I think that, Putin read that correctly. Perhaps he was also, peeved by the repeated statements from Tony Blinken and Avril Haines and all the other new officials saying, essentially, we're not, China, 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 not Russia, Russia, Russia. And this, Putin is excellent at inserting himself back onto the Washington radar. And that is certainly one element, although not the only element of what's going on here. And I do think it's an interesting case study in terms of how Biden and his team are approaching the Europeans. It's not the kind of consultation where, everyone's invited in for a seat at the table before big decisions like Afghanistan are made. But one thing I heard very loud and clearly was on Nord Stream, no matter how much Republicans tried to make that a public issue in Washington, even holding up some of the confirmations of Biden officials over the issue of Nord Stream and sanctions on companies that do business with it. What I heard was very different, which was essentially like, in a practical sense, why would we really stake ourselves on something that's more than 90% done that we believe is ultimately going to get finished? And then secondarily, a real prioritization of the relationship with Germany is too important on too many issues, which include China, of course, as well as Russia, that we're not going to jeopardize that because of this pipeline. And I think that has been the approach so far going into it. The question I have is actually, how far is Putin willing to go, and how much will he escalate? Because that is going to change very much what you're hearing from Washington. It is notable that you have not seen Alexei Navalny's name, even in the readouts that the White House has been putting out of Biden's conversation with Putin, or of the conversation, that other officials have been having. And I think that, they've been trying, it seems to me, to send signals of buying time and not, wanting to be locked in this cycle of accommodation versus confrontation. But, this was not a trap that they wanted to be boxed in by. And it's interesting, right, to hear Biden at the same time he's imposing these sanctions, in the same breath, offering Putin a summit. And we all know Vladimir Putin loves a big superpower summit that aggrandizes Russia and its role in the world, and his own role as well as distracting Russians from their internal troubles. Why did Biden do that? I mean, clearly it also might have the effect of freezing things in place, of making Putin more reluctant to invade Ukraine if he's about to lose a summit with Washington. And so I saw those as purposefully contradictory messages. On the one hand, sanctions, on the other hand, the offer of the summit. Just quickly on a couple of the other questions to Sir Peter's excellent question about process versus, who's really in charge, who's really making decisions, and does it even matter that there's a return to what we might consider regular order? The trend towards centralizing executive authority in the White House and in the National Security Council continues unabated. And I do see that as the model here. I think that that's what the folks at the Pentagon, including Biden political appointees, are already seeing, and it's also, you should remember, we're talking about this before it's even 100 days into a new administration. There are, I believe, 3 confirmed Biden appointees at the State Department right now. I'm not even sure there are 3 at the Pentagon already. This is a very, very new administration, which the political weight and the administration itself essentially is the White House right now because of the extreme sclerotic nature of our system and how slow and tedious it is to get appointees through, especially because now there's the sort of Democratic Party vetting at a hypersensitive and hypercharged moment of reckoning over the unacceptably white male nature of all previous administrations, Democratic and Republican. There's 2 layers to this process right now. And so that's just the other thing I would flag. As far as Turkey, again, they don't want to deal with it. It seems to me, Sir Peter, that this is just a problem they know exists. They're very savvy to it. These are the folks who lived the reality of dealing with Erdogan in the Obama era and feeling actually very burned. While Obama once said that Erdogan was the world leader he got along with the best at the very beginning of his administration, they felt incredibly burned by Erdogan by the end of the 2 terms in office. And so, I just see it as they want to talk about COVID, and internationally they're fixated on China. So that's pretty much how I see it.
Thank you, Susan. Stephen.
I'll try to be brief so we can get to more questions. Just on the Russia question, it looks like a kind of autopilot relationship between the US and Russia. And Biden admitted as much when he announced new sanctions last week. But I wonder whether, in the next 4 years, the kind of contradictions that have been put in play in the relationship may come to a head, and there may be some kind of resolution one way for another. And the site of this resolution may well be Ukraine, which is making a bid for NATO membership, which, may well end either in Ukraine getting such membership or being put on a path to do so again, or the administration may make clear that one way or another that that's simply not going to happen, which would effectively mean that the expansion of NATO since the 1990s is probably over. And so either way, perhaps we are coming to some kind of shift 3 decades after the Soviet Union collapsed, in which the U.S.-NATO relationship is going to change and certainly not be one of enlargement anymore. Or the Biden administration may find itself making commitments to Ukraine that it can't keep, and that could, I worry, provoke instability there. So I think this will be very interesting to see in the next year and the next 4 years. And Hans's question is very interesting. I share Gideon's skepticism that we're seeing a kind of return to George W. Bush freedom agenda like framing. I mean, that is at present in Biden's framing of a global struggle between democracy and authoritarianism, yes. But at this particular moment, that kind of framing also comes with much less American exceptionalism, not the assumption that the United States has perfected its political model, and therefore that model should be diffused globally, whether through the force of arms or not. Now, I think it's it's a much more circumspect approach. But look, I share Hans's, I think what I'm detecting is Hans's concern that after the Trump administration got tough with China, but in a way that was not very palatable to the American political class, Biden may have, stumbled upon, and this is why I think it's the Cold War that's the better metaphor than George W. Bush's freedom agenda, a formula for ideologizing a U.S.-China confrontation as one that's essentially about the U.S. leading the free world against Chinese, the Chinese other. And we've seen some hints of this in the way that, for example, Secretary of State Blinken has cast China as antithetical to world order or to the rules-based international order. And that is a shift from what occurred under the Obama administration. And it also contradicts, the administration's desire, I think, ultimately to focus on domestic priorities and to tackle global challenges like climate change. So these contradictions are there. I actually think it's totally unclear to me where the Biden administration wants to go in reframing America's role in the world at this point. They've put up a lot of different options, and I don't think they've landed anywhere in particular.
Yeah, that's an interesting last comment to end that round on. And I guess after 100 days, when an administration has been dealing with a devastating pandemic, and frankly, we haven't mentioned it, but it is extraordinary, as we all know, to watch the vaccine rollout. Whatever you might think of the previous year, it is quite remarkable how rapidly things are now beginning to change, which will give latitude potentially to the administration to think more strategically. We'll see. It's a division of labor, of course. And I'll say again, I am waiting, and I know we all are waiting to see what the decision on the Derek Chauvin trial will be. And the police vans are lined up all over New York City, anticipating that, if it's not what people want, it's going to be a tough period of time in the US. So a lot on the domestic front. But I want to come to Mary Dejevsky and Elena Lazarou. I know, Mary, you wanted to follow up on one of Sir Peter's questions, but if you could unmute and introduce yourself.
I wanted to follow up on Sir Peter's question, where he alluded very diplomatically to consultation with the allies when he was talking about process. And I wondered whether the panelists could comment on the quite public dissent that we've seen in recent days from the UK top brass, from General Nick Carter, and today in an article in the Times from the former Foreign Secretary Lord Haig about the decision to withdraw from Afghanistan. Now, they both concede that the UK has no choice but to follow. But I have to say, I was quite surprised by how openly they were dissenting from that decision. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. And Elena?
Good evening. Thank you all for a great discussion. I'm Elena Lazarou. I'm an associate fellow here at the US and Americas program. I had a question to Susan. You mentioned this creative multilateralism, and I think indeed we're seeing this kind of engagement, for example, on climate and this idea of conference of democracies. But what about traditional multilateral issues that are still unresolved and which bring the US in a disagreement with traditional allies? And I'm thinking here, I'm blocking the WTO appellate body. That's a big issue that some allies, democratic allies are on a different side of the fence from the US. So what about that approach with that issue, that multilateral issue? And a question on this free world versus China, or like-minded partners versus China. I think that's a big issue for both the US and the EU, because I think there's a more nuanced issue there. Is like, who is this free world? Is it also democracies where the human rights situation is not exactly what the EU and US standards would be? So does that mean Biden is ready to engage with democracies and overlook their human rights records in certain parts of the world? Particularly, I'm thinking Southeast Asia, but Turkey has come up as well. The verdict's still out. So I'd be very interested in this democracy and human rights. What is the free world? So thank you very much.
Thank you, Elena. We're not going to have time to take the rest of the questions, but there are some really terrific ones. I hope you will have seen them. People are curious about Kamala Harris. I mean, that's been a wait and see kind of moment by design. I'm sure more questions about China and Russia. And I think it demonstrates the depth of interest, not only in the topic and in the world and US and America's role in it, but especially in you, Susan, Gideon, and Stephen, for your comments. Let me come to you perhaps in reverse order of how you initially spoke to answer those and to wrap up, since we're coming to the end. So I guess that means that Gideon, you get to go first.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, lots of really interesting questions. I mean, I thought the very last one is the one I'd like to respond to, which is this whole question of democracy and democratic allies and so on. And I do think it is, difficult. And as Stephen said, kind of reminiscent of the Cold War, that you have this rhetoric of freedom versus authoritarianism, which on a kind of deep level, I do buy. China is becoming increasingly sinister, authoritarian place. We can see what Putin is doing, God forbid, the possible death of Navalny soon. So these are, they're not only authoritarian countries, they're becoming more authoritarian. But if you're trying to push back against them in a sort of great power competition way, then you need all the friends you can get. The definition that you come up with, or they've come up with, is the democratic free world. But unfortunately, some of the most important components of that free world are, to use the sort of voguish word, problematic at the moment. India, most obviously, where, yes, it's clearly not China, but it is becoming less democratic. In fact, talking to sort of liberals in India when I was still able to travel was a bit like talking to liberals in Ankara. This horrible feeling that things that they had taken for granted, free press, not being worried about losing their job at the university or in the civil service, or about, God forbid, being arrested, whatever, that those things could no longer be taken for granted. And these, it's very hard, though, for America to acknowledge that when India is so key to its pushback against China. The first thing that Biden does is have this Quad meeting with Australia, India, Japan, and so on. I gather that behind the scenes, there is some debate in the administration about, well, what do we do about democratic backsliding in India? I suspect, to the extent they remain focused on great power competition, unless Modi does something truly egregious, they will try to ignore it. But India is just the biggest example of a question that's going to keep recurring. If you have this alliance of democracies, do you not invite Hungary? I mean, quite hard to justify inviting them, but on the other hand, they're in NATO. Poland, where does that fit in? So it is, it's a big problem. It's why I think they might be well advised not to have a summit of democracies, because the guest list becomes immediately a difficult issue. But it's also, Stephen suggests, a problem that's kind of has a Cold War ring to it. Because broadly speaking, the free world characterization is, I think, has got something to it. But when you get into the details, it becomes complicated.
Thank you, Gideon. So much we could have a separate panel, and I'm sure we will, about why it's not a Cold War, no matter how bad it gets. But it's certainly an analogy that people like to wrap their head around. Susan.
Well, thank you. These are such great questions, and I'm sorry we can't get to all of them today, because it's really been an excellent conversation and helpful for me in thinking through these issues. I guess the final thing I would like to leave us on, which hits at this question of what is a democracy anymore, and I'm reassured on the one hand that a return to regular order is what we're seeing when they're the second guessing is immediate on every front, as it should be, to a new administration, and a lot of it occurs without reference to the context that we've just been living with in the last 4 years. And certainly there is continuity. These are not easy questions. America was ripe for poking about its hypocrisy on foreign policy long before someone named Donald Trump was around. But I guess I would just leave you, that is a context that I think It's shocking on some level, but it's also very predictable and not surprising how quickly that context has faded. And, on the one hand, again, I find these all to be important and legitimate questions about how Biden's going to proceed. And I don't think we have answers on a lot of it. They've been, if anything, very cautious and, willing to disappoint the expectations raised to a certain extent by the change in administrations. But again, we talk about Democratic backsliding and, the hypocrisy of, who we're going to be dealing with. You're dealing with a situation where Donald Trump was very, very close, within a few tens of thousands of votes in several key states from winning a second term in the presidency. Donald Trump didn't just have like an unfortunate habit with Twitter. I mean, there was a connection between his words and his actions. And a lot of the story of his 4 years was of his struggling to figure out how to knock down the restraints that stopped him from doing many of the things he wanted to do. And Gideon, I don't even think it's a matter of speculation. I'm glad you raised it. I think it was a fact that Donald Trump and his approach to the European Union, as well as NATO in a second term, would have been extremely confrontational and across a wide variety of fronts. I think that the United States wouldn't be talking about, well, gee, how should we proceed in multilateral institutions, but you would see more and more examples like the US withdrawal from the World Health Organization and the active participation by the United States in dismantling, the institutions of international governance that it had previously participated in building. Again, I know that, actually it's been, I think, a mark of Trump's remarkable success in convincing people that, somehow it was just the quirks of his personality or, the Twitter feed, but it was real what he was doing. And I think it would have been much more dramatic over time as he acquired not just the more tools of power, but more and more people over time who were willing to do what he wanted. So don't lose that context because this was a very near run sort of a thing, it seems to me. And, these are great questions that we don't know the answer to yet, but, we're still in the crisis.
Thank you for that, Susan. I think it's incredibly important reminder because sometimes you breathe a deep sigh and you look forward and not back and you don't imagine the alternative. And I think I'm with you on how dark the alternative would likely have been, not only for the United States, but also for those on the other end of America's external engagements. Stephen, I'll leave it to you for your final remarks.
Well, Susan's final remarks really should be the final remarks, but I can't resist coming back to the notion of the free world, which I think we will see more of in the years to come. In its utility lies that label precisely in how during the Cold War it allowed for the Portuguese dictatorship, the Greek monarchy, and others who were not liberal capitalist democracies to fit into it because it was defined negatively. It is defined against in other that leads a mutually exclusive order. So you can see the attraction of that kind of framing. If the United States wants to essentially pursue great power competition or China containment, but dress it with a little bit more purpose. But the problem is that, US allies don't want to choose, many in Europe and in East Asia and elsewhere. And for that matter, the United States doesn't want to choose either. American business and finance was on board with trying to get a better deal from China, but not much interest in decoupling, or even a belief, if you look at the stock market, that decoupling is a serious possibility. So perhaps what we are seeing is a kind of zombie Cold War or a performative Cold War in which the ideological sheen of the Cold War returns, but not quite the substance. And that may make this framework less durable than I might myself fear on most occasions. But I should end on this pessimistic note. Even a zombie or performative Cold War does risk World War III.
Oh my goodness. Oh, now I understand why I wanted you to go last, Stephen, to be sure that we would meet again to discuss that. Stephen, Gideon, and Susan, I should remind you that this is only what, the 7th or 8th day since London has been open since a very strict lockdown that started at around just after Christmas. And it's after 7 o'clock at night, and everybody stayed with us. And I think the weather is actually pretty good. That says quite a lot for a country and a city that is desperate to get out of Zoom and out of the house, about how remarkable your contributions, not only on this call, but especially in your writing over the course of your careers. And we are tremendously grateful for your time. And I really, really do hope Stephen, Gideon, and especially you, Susan, since I believe this is the first time I've seen you at Chatham House in my short time, I hope that you will all return frequently, often, and engage with us. Thank you so much. And thank you to Sir Peter and Mick Cox and Hans and Elena and all my colleagues who have joined the call. Thank you so much, and to my team. Thanks so much.